Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're going to be taking a look at a subscriber-submitted deck by JYS, so thank you very much for that. It's an Artifact Emerge deck. We'll get into the deck in a second, but a quick little note. If you do want your deck to be featured in a future subscriber deck series, then be sure to send it either in the comments section below, via email, or on Twitter. Whatever's fine with you is fine with me, as long as I get it, we'll play it. Alright, let's get into the deck, shall we? So, Artifact Emerge. Emerge is a older mechanic coming from Eldritch Moon, I believe it is. Yeah. Emerge essentially says that you can cast this spell by sacrificing a creature and paying the Emerge cost reduced by that creature's converted mana cost. So, for example, Elder Deep Fiend costs 7 to emerge, 5 and 2 blue. Well, we can sacrifice maybe a Filigree Familiar that costs 3, so we can take 3 off of the emerge cost right there, so it costs a lot less. So let's have a look at the deck anyway, as it stands. It's a very good value deck as well. There's a lot of recursion, so the creatures that you sacrifice you can get back, and the way to get some of them back as well involves some emerging of its own, so you can really cycle your way through the deck over and over and over again, so you don't really lose steam so much. It depends on how it plays anyway. There is always the variance aspect of decks that makes sure that it doesn't work all of the time, but it works most of the time, and it's been really good value from what I've been playing. So, let's have a look at the deck. First of all, we got Fatal Push, so for 1 black mana, instant speed, destroy target creature if it has converted mana cost 2 or less. And then it also has a Revolt mechanic, which is new from Aether Revolt. You get to destroy a creature if it has converted mana cost 4 or less instead, if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn. So the whole deck revolves around permanents leaving the battlefield via emerge costs and stuff like that. So we can actually trigger Revolt that way. We can flash in a Deep Fiend, for example, on our opponent's turn, which will enable Revolt. We can flash it in on our own turn, with every other emerge creature. But we can also bounce creatures with Jace or with Burrell, that kind of thing, or they could just die in combat. Either one of those will trigger Revolt. So right at the very beginning, Fatal Push for 1 mana, killing a creature with converted mana cost 2 or less is pretty good value, and later down the line you can hit things with converted mana cost 4 or less as well. So you can really, it has late game potential. Not like extreme late game, but it depends on the deck that you're playing. If it's aggro, then 4 converted mana cost pretty much covers most aggro cards that are going to be in there. But if it's ramp, then it's definitely not going to hit an Ulamog, even if it didn't have Indestructible, that kind of thing. So we've got 3 copies of that. We then have Grasp of Darkness, so for 2 black mana, instant speed, target creature gets -4 until the end of the turn. So Grasp of Darkness is essentially here for everything that Fatal Push does not hit. For the most part, the power and toughness, -4 will kill a lot of things in the format. There's a lot of 5-drops, for example, that have 4 toughness, so we can easily take out some creatures with one of these as well, if we can't do it with a Fatal Push. Next, we've got Resourceful Return. This will become more relevant as we go through the deck, but for 1 and a black, sorcery speed, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and then, if you control an artifact, draw a card. So this is Artifact Emerge, so most of the cards that are going to go into our graveyard in the early game are indeed artifacts. So we have our Pilgrim I, Filigree Familiar, Treasure Keeper, and we even have Weaponscraft Enthusiasts that can make servo tokens. So we very likely have an artifact on the field. So Resourceful Return for 2 mana can get back any creature from our graveyard. So it might be something that we've just emerged, or it might be the emerged creature itself. Either way, we can get that. And as long as we have an artifact, then that is also a cantrip as well. So this is going to go into our graveyard and replace itself, essentially, which is a lot of value to have. Next, we have Weaponcraft Enthusiast. So for 2 and a black, we have a 0/1 creature with Fabricate 2. And Fabricate is essentially, when it enters the battlefield, you get to either do 2 things. You get to put 2 +1/+1 counters on it, or make 2 +1/+1 servos instead. Most of the time we probably want to have servos so that we can create those artifacts for the Resourceful Return, but also for the chump blockers as well. And Weaponcraft Enthusiast, if it is a 0/1, is a great target for Emerge as well. It cuts 3 mana off of the Emerge cost. So if we're making servos, we're not losing all of the value from the creature when we emerge it. We actually have 2 power on the board after we sacrifice the Enthusiast, which is a 0/1. So as soon as this guy comes on the field, he's ready to be emerged, essentially. We then have Pilgrim's Eye, so for 3 mana, it's a 1/1 flyer. When Pilgrim's Eye enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. So, Pilgrim's Eye is a great card to emerge as well. 3 converted mana cost cuts the price of the emerge down quite significantly, so we can pretty much emerge a creature out straight after we use our Pilgrim's Eye on the next turn. But it also allows us to get our basic lands as well, because we do have a lot of double blues and double blacks as well that are going to be coming up shortly after the Pilgrim's Eye, so this allows us to get whichever double colour we need and make sure that we hit our land drops on time as well. So it's really good value for that. We then have Filigree Familiar, so for 3 mana, yet again another target for emerge, but this one's slightly better than the Pilgrim's Eye. 3 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature, so it triggers Resourceful Return. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life, and when it leaves the battlefield, or more specifically dies, we get to draw a card. So if we use it as a chump blocker against our opponent, we're gaining value. If we use it to emerge a creature, we're actually going to draw a card as well, so we're getting value. And when it enters the battlefield, it's gaining value just straight away, so this is a really good value creature and an easy auto-include in this kind of deck. We then have Treasure Keeper. It's kind of the same thing, but a little bit more expensive, and it doesn't gain us the life. So for 4 mana, we get a 3/3, which is a decent attacker and blocker. However, when it dies, you get to reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land card with converted mana cost 3 or less, and then you get to cast that card without paying its mana cost, and the rest of the cards go onto the bottom of your library in any order. So if we have a Treasure Keeper die, either by emerging it or our opponent kills it in combat or something like that, we go all the way through our deck until we hit something that is not mana cost 3 or more, so anything 3 or less that's not a land, that gets cast. So we either get a Filigree Familiar to replace it, or maybe we get a Resourceful Return and we get to return a creature back to our hand, or we even get a Fatal Push or a Grasp of Darkness as a little bit of removal in response to our opponents killing the Treasure Keeper. So maybe we block with Treasure Keeper, take 3 damage onto that creature, and that is enough to cover the Grasp of Darkness to kill it, that kind of thing. You have to get a little bit lucky on that sort of thing, but at the very least, we're always going to get a decent amount of value from the Treasure Keeper, and it is a great emerge target as well. We then have Thopter Spy Network, so for 2 and 2 blue, we have an enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you control an artifact, which we will most likely will, you get to put a 1/1 colourless Thopter artifact creature token with flying onto the battlefield. When 1 or more artifact creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, we get to draw a card. So this is a good way of keeping the threats up for our opponent. The flyers over the top are really annoying, but it's also a card advantage for us as well. So if we're playing against something that's like maybe controlling, waiting for us to run out of steam, it's not going to happen with a Thopter Spy Network on the field. So they really have to find an answer for this before it gets out of hand. As I mentioned, we have a lot of artifacts as well to trigger the Spy Network, and even Tezzeret makes artifact Delirium cells as well, so there is a good chance that Thopter Spy Network will be triggered every single turn as well, so it is pretty sweet, and the card advantage is awesome. As we mentioned, we've got Tezzeret the Schemer, so for 2, a blue and a black, we've got a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. Works really well in this deck. For the +1, we get to create a colourless artifact token named Delirium Cell with the ability to sacrifice itself and add 1 mana of any colour to our mana pool. So if we're missing that double blue or that double black that we don't need to cast Tezzeret, we can actually +1, create an Ethereum Cell, and that is a 5 colour land essentially for 1 turn, as long as we don't sacrifice it. But there are other things that you can do with those Delirium Cells as well. They do trigger Thopter Spy Network, and it's pretty sweet. And also the Resourceful Return as well. Get some value off of that. So, his -2 ability, as I said, the Ethereum Cells do have a bit of a benefit even later down the line if you're not using them for mana. The -2, for example, target creature gets +X, -X until the end of the turn, where X is the number of artifacts you control. I keep forgetting that that is a +X, actually. So, it's great for killing your opponent's creatures, but maybe if you have an exact amount of artifacts, you could actually maybe even pump your own creature up, so maybe giving, you know, the Filigree Familiar +1/-1, so it attacks him for 3 as a 3/1, that kind of thing. But for the most part, it is removal for your opponent's creatures if you've got the artifacts for it. So that is pretty sweet. He is -7. Hopefully we get to show it off. I think I've ultimated on this channel once before with Tezzeret. But if we haven't, hopefully we get to this time. You get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, target artifact you control becomes a 5/5 power and toughness creature. So those Ethereum cells can suddenly be turned into 5/5s. Also, our treasure keepers get a +2/+2 buff. But most of all, our Pilgrim's Eyes become 5/5 flyers then. So we have a lot of value as well. Even our Thopters as well, we can turn into 5/5s. So he's pretty sweet, is that emblem. And it doesn't take him very long to get there. In fact, 3 turns after Tezzeret is on, you know, ticking up twice to make the Ethereum cells, ticking down and sacking him if you want to do that. Then you get to create 5/5s for the rest of the game, so long as you can generate artifacts, which is pretty sweet. We then have Burrell's Expertise, so for 3 and 2 blue sorcery speed, return up to 3 target artifacts and or creatures to their owner's hands. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So, if we have a board full of our emerge creatures, but we want to reuse them, we can bounce our own creatures again and re-emerge stuff. We could also clear our opponent's board if we want to do so. Maybe get rid of a Dynavolt tower or 2 as well. But we also get the added bonus of being able to cast a 4 or less converted mana cost card. So that includes Tezzeret, Thopter Spy Network, and everything down here. So we have a lot of targets for Burrell's Expertise. There is going to be a good chance that we can make good use of that secondary ability right there. We then have Jace, Unraveler of Secrets, so for 3 and 2 blue, 5 loyalty planeswalker. His +1 ability allows us to scry one and then draw a card, so we get to set up the top card of our deck. If we like it, we draw it. If we don't, then we get to draw a card that we are unaware of, which can most likely be better than the card we just scried to the bottom as well, so we can go fairly deep with Jace in that sense as well. He's -2, return target creature to its owner's hand, so we get to bounce a creature. This is his way of protecting himself, not for very long, but if our opponents maybe emerged their own creature perhaps and they had no other creature, then their Deep Fiend cost them 8 instead of maybe, 2 or 3, that kind of thing. So we can maybe get good value out of that if our opponent's playing an emerge card, or if they've got no benefit to casting the card or entering the battlefield as well. We slow our opponent down by that minus ability. Finally, his -8 ability. If you manage to get this down, it's a good chance that you're going to win, although if you've got no pressure on the board to begin with, then there is also that chance that your opponent can come out of this. But the ultimate ability says you get an emblem with whenever an opponent casts his or her first spell each turn, counter that spell. So suddenly we're 2-for-1ing every single one of our opponent's cards. So if they want to get rid of our Elder Deep Fiend, they need to have 2 removal spells, or some kind of fodder card anyway to get countered first of all before they kill our Elder Deep Fiend. So we're suddenly getting superior value on our opponent right there. So that's why you usually win, because your opponent will run out of cards before you do quite easily. Next we have Obnixilis Reignited, so for 3 and 2 black, 5 loyalty planeswalker. His +1 says you get to draw a card and lose 1 life, so we get to keep that card advantage trading going against control. That is horrible for our opponent, and also it just keeps us finding our emerge creatures or maybe our emerge fodder as well if we need it. So it's really good for that kind of thing. It doesn't take him too long to get to the ultimate, and I have ultimated Obnixilis quite often actually. It's not as consistent as you might hope, but you do get there fairly often. His -3 ability though is really awesome. It's one of the main reasons to run him if you are trying to control your opponent's board. -3, essentially just destroy target creature. It's murder on a creature. So, you know, it's just hard casted removal for anything that maybe our Grasp of Darkness or our Fatal Push doesn't hit. Finally, his -8, his ultimate. Target opponent gets an emblem with whenever a player draws a card, you lose 2 life. So we have a lot of card draw in this deck, and it is whenever a player draws a card. So our opponent draws a card, he loses 2 life. If we draw a card, he loses 2 life. So suddenly our Jace adds... this does 2 damage to your opponent, or even our Resourceful Return draws us a card, deals 2 damage to our opponent. Filigree Familiar dying, draws us a card, deals 2 damage, that kind of thing. So, yeah, even our Thopter Spy Network can draw a card. So we can actually close out the game quite fast with Obnixilis in this deck. It's really nice synergies for that kind of thing. Next we have Noxious Gearhulk, so for 4 and 2 black we have a 5/4 with Menace. It is an artifact creature, so it does trigger all of our artifact synergies. When Noxious Gearhulk enters the battlefield, you may destroy another target creature. If a creature is destroyed this way, you gain life equal to its toughness. So if we are low on life, maybe we've been using Obnixilus's +1 for far too long, or we've been against aggro and we need to stabilise, Noxious Gearhulk is a great way to do that. It's also a menace creature as well, so we can push through our opponent's chump blockers if they're making loads of plant tokens or servos. Then they're going to have to double block in order to stop us getting in with our menace, because menace means whenever that creature attacks, it must be, well, if you want to block it, you have to block with 2 or more creatures, essentially. So there is that. And we can also destroy our opponent's greatest creatures as well, gaining life equal to its toughness, which allows us to stabilise. Next, we're on to our emerge cards. This is how the deck works. This is how the cycle goes on. We've got Elder Deep Fiend, one of the best emerge cards to come out of Magic. So for 8 mana, it's a 5/6 with Flash and Eldrazi Octopus. Although you probably won't be casting it for 8 mana, though when we get to the late game, maybe we will. But it does have an emerge cost of 5 and 2 blue, and as I mentioned, you can sacrifice a creature to cut the cost of that emerge as well. When you cast Elder Deep Fiend, you get to tap up to 4 target permanents, so maybe our opponent's left back a few chump blockers and we have lethal on board. If only we could get past their creatures. Well, Elder Deep Fiend allows us to flash that on his end step, tap all of his creatures down, and then we get to swing him for lethal. Also, if we fear that he maybe has a board wipe or something like that, in response to him casting a creature at the start of his turn, fortunately you can't do upkeep casts unless they have an upkeep trigger on their side, which is where you ideally want to cast Elder Deep Fiend anyway. But we can maybe tap down all of a single colour as well, so we lock him out of a colour so that he can't stop us. So if we know he's got a board wipe, like a planar outburst, we tap all of his white, and there's nothing he can do about the creatures on our board for another turn. So Elder Deep Fiend can do a lot like that. So it's 7 mana with 2 blue. We can't cut the 2 blue off of the emerge cost, but we can cut 4 of the 5 colourless, for example. So we can get him out as cheap as 2 mana if we are sacrificing another emerge creature, or as cheap as 3 if we are using our artifact fodder. So that's not too bad. That usually means Elder Deep Fiend can come out on the turn 4 or even turn 5, depending on which of our artifact creatures we have available at the time. We then have Distended Mindbender. So for 8 mana, we have a 5/5, emerge 7 again, except for this time with 2 black. When you cast Distended Mindbender, target opponent reveals his or her hand. You choose from it a non-land card with converted mana cost 3 or less, and a card with converted mana cost 4 or greater. That player discards those cards. So when Mindbender comes down, we get to remove 2 of our opponent's best cards, essentially. One of the cheap, maybe, removal spells for the Mindbender, and later on maybe one of his game-winning cards. So if he has an Ulamog and he has a Declaration in Stone for our Mindbender, we get to take both of them, that kind of thing. And we can, of course, sacrifice Mindbender, stick it into the graveyard, and then Resourceful Return so that we can do it again, that kind of thing. And as we go to the Vexing Scuttler, you see how the cycle can continue. Yet again, 8 mana for a 4/5 creature this time, with emerge 6 and a blue. 7 total. When you cast Vexing Scuttler, you may return target instant or sorcery card from your graveyard to your hand. So Vexing Scuttler is mostly in here to grab the Resourceful Returns, or even the removal for our opponent's creatures. But mostly, we want to emerge it, grab the Resourceful Return, which allows us to grab our emerge fodder, or maybe one of our emerge creatures from out of the graveyard, and we can keep cycling that back and forth. So Vexing Scuttler comes down, he grabs Resourceful Return, that kind of thing, and then we Burrell's Expertise, bouncing the Vexing Scuttler, and whatever else we have on board. We then emerge yet again, grabbing Resourceful Return, or even Burrell's Expertise, that kind of thing. So we can keep going with the Vexing Scuttler, keep the value going on these emerge creatures as well. Maybe even the Noxious Gearhulks, that kind of thing. So that's essentially the deck. Let's go on to the mana base now. We have 5 islands and 8 swamps. As you can see, we are heavily curved into black, but we do have a lot of colourless cards, so it doesn't really matter too much in terms of getting our double blues and double blacks, because we do have the Pilgrim's Eye as well to fetch up the double of whatever colour we need on turn 3. Because we don't need the double until turn 4 anyway, so we do kind of need it for Grasp of Darkness, but we have Fatal Push to hold us out until that comes along anyway. So, yeah, the mana's been pretty good for me so far, and that's why we're going for that curve, because we're not really using too many blue cards in this deck. and we're using a fair bit of colourless as well. So we then have Sunken Holla. Sunken Holla enters the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. So basic lands include the island and the swamp, so if we've got 2 or more of them on the battlefield, then turn 3 Sunken Holla comes into play untapped, that kind of thing. It's also an island or a swamp, and that will become relevant as I get into the rest of the mana base. We then have Westvale Abbey, so this is a colourless land. It says pay 5 and tap it, pay 1 life. Put a 1/1 white and black human cleric token onto the battlefield. So this is a nice way of protecting ourselves if we've got nothing on board. Maybe they're attacking in with an Ulamog or some big creature without trample. Instead of taking 10 damage, we instead take 1 damage and we chump with our 1/1 token, that kind of thing. But most of all, what we want to be doing with Westvale Abbey, and it's not too difficult to pull it off either, is pay 5, tap it, sacrifice 5 creatures, transform the Westvale Abbey into Ormondal the Profane Prince. Ormondal the Profane Prince is a legendary creature that has 9 power and 7 toughness, but it is also flying, lifelink, indestructible, and has haste as well, so it can attack the turn that we transform it, which is awesome. A 9/7 flying in the air is usually enough to close out the game if our opponent has no blockers, and that life swing as well with the lifelink allows us to swing in without too much fear of the crackback as well, if we do completely swing in with everything that we have. Because we will have been sacrificing our entire board to do this as well. So if we're doing this, we probably either want to be fairly confident we're going to win the game, or the lifelink we're going to gain from it is going to win us it on the spot anyway. So Ormondal's not too difficult to pull off because we do have a lot of Filigree Familiars, Pilgrim's Eyes, but most of all we have Weaponcraft Enthusiasts that actually, this guy makes 3 creatures for us to sacrifice, so we only have to have 2 more creatures on the board at that time in order to get that going. So maybe turn 3 Weaponcraft, turn 4 Pilgrim's Eye, turn 5 Filigree Familiar, and then finally turn 6 Ormondal off the top, and we maybe finish our opponent right then and there. Never know. But yeah, he's one of those late game surprises for our opponent. If they're not paying too much attention, we can get a Westvale Abbey win right there and then. We then have Drowned Catacomb. Drowned Catacomb enters the battlefield unless you control an island or a swamp. So we've got our basics, but we also have Sunken Holla, which is also an island or a swamp. So if this guy came down on turn 1, then we can bring in Drowned Catacomb that will come into play untapped on turn 2, which is pretty sweet. So we have double blue and double black as soon as turn 2, so we can do our Grasp of Darkness, that kind of cool stuff. We then have Ruins of Oran Reef. Ruins of Oran Reef enters the battlefield tapped. It is a colourless mana, however it does have the extra ability, which is the reason to play it. You get to put a 1/1 counter on target colourless creature that entered the battlefield this turn. So all of our emerge creatures are colourless, so we can stick a counter on any one of them that we want. But also, most of our emerge fodder as well is also colourless, so our Pilgrim's Eye can be 2/2s, our Filigree Familiars 3/3s, and so on and so forth. So we can make pretty decent creatures over the top with the Ruins of Oran Reef. And finally we have Inventors Fair. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life. Adds colourless to a mana pool. There's also a legendary land as well, so we can only have 1 on the battlefield at any given time. If we put the second one on, it will legend rule itself and we'll have to sacrifice 1 for no value essentially. But we can also sacrifice it as well for paying 4 mana, and we get to search our library for an artifact card, reveal it and put it into your hand, then search your library. You can only do this if you have 3 or more artifacts, which is quite likely to happen thanks to the sheer number of artifacts. So what can we search up? We can get ourselves a Noxious Gearhulk as removal. We can go find some treasure keepers for emerge fodder, that kind of thing. There's not really too many options, but the main one that you really want to be searching for if you are going to sacrifice it is for the Noxious Gearhulk. Mostly I feel like it's probably going to get most of its value out of the first ability to gain 1 life. Anyway guys, that is going to do it for the deck. If you did enjoy the look of the list and you want to check out the matches, they should already be up by now, so be sure to check out the channel for that. Be sure to like and subscribe if you did enjoy the deck tech, and be sure to hit that little bell icon as well to be notified when the matches go up day to day. We'll be doing 3 videos on this deck most likely. Alright guys, hope you enjoyed, and I will see you in the matches. See you later.